The train juddered, a final, weary sigh escaping its iron lungs as it pulled into Prairie View. Eliza clutched the worn carpetbag in her lap, its meager contents a testament to the life she'd left behind, a life of thinning soup and fading hopes. The advert had been stark: wife wanted, sober habits, homely duties, S. Blackwood, Bar M Ranch, no mention of love, only utility. Her reply had been equally stark, admitting her lack of dowry, her only asset a willingness to work. She had no money, only a sliver of desperate courage. The platform was a raw gash of timber in an ocean of grass that stretched, undulating and immense, to a horizon that seemed to swallow the sky. A man detached himself from the shadow of the station house. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered like old leather beneath a sweat-stained hat. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were direct, assessing. Silas Blackwood. He was older than she'd imagined, lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth, telling of sun and wind and years of unspoken thoughts. Miss Miller. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Eliza nodded, her throat tight. Mr. Blackwood. He took her bag with a brusque efficiency that allowed for no pleasantries. The buckboard waiting was sturdy, the horses powerful. Everything about him, about this place, spoke of a stark, unyielding strength. The town, a handful of wooden buildings huddled against the immensity, watched them pass with an unnerving stillness. She felt the weight of eyes, heard the whisper of unspoken judgments. Mail order bride, penniless, desperate. The Bar M ranch house sat miles from town, a solid two-story structure of timber and stone, built to withstand whatever the plains could throw at it. It was large, prosperous even, but a chill emanated from it that had nothing to do with the prairie wind. Inside, the rooms were spacious, the furniture heavy and dark, but an air of disuse hung heavy. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through grimy windows. It was a house that had known a woman's touch long ago, and missed it. Your room. He gestured to a small chamber at the back, overlooking a struggling vegetable patch. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, a rickety wardrobe, clean but bare. Later, over a supper of cold beef and day-old bread eaten in near silence at a long, polished table, he laid out the terms. The work is hard. The winters are harder. I expect. I need someone who can manage the house, cook, clean, mend, keep things in order. He didn't meet her eye. There's a preacher comes through once a month. We can make it legal then, if you're still inclined. Eliza looked at her hands, clasped in her lap. They were capable hands, if roughened by too much scrubbing and too little food. I understand, Mr. Blackwood. I'm not afraid of work. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. Her heart, a small, frightened bird, beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't a marriage. It was an employment contract with vows attached. Yet, what choice did she have? Behind her lay nothing but destitution. Before her, a chance, however slim, however barren it seemed. I'll stay, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet firm. He nodded once, a flicker in those cool eyes she couldn't decipher. Relief, or simply acknowledgement of a transaction completed. The days settled into a rhythm of toil. Eliza rose before dawn, the chill of the house seeping into her bones. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached, aired out dusty rooms, battled the persistent prairie dust that coated every surface. She found a rhythm in the kneading of dough, a small satisfaction in the neat stacks of mended clothes. Silas Blackwood was a silent presence. He ate what she cooked without comment, his eyes missing nothing. He was out on the range from sunup to sundown, a distant figure lost in the vastness of his land. The loneliness was a physical ache, a constant companion. The wind, always the wind, moaned around the eaves, a desolate song. She spoke more to the chickens she started tending in a disused coop than to the man whose name she would soon take. Her internal landscape mirrored the sparse prairie, wide, empty, with a horizon that seemed to offer little comfort. She thought often of the small, wilting rosebush her mother had cherished, how she'd coaxed it to bloom each year. Here, everything felt too harsh for such tender things. One afternoon, she tackled the small, neglected vegetable patch. The soil was hard, unforgiving. She found a rusted hoe and set to work, her back protesting, her hands blistering. Hours later, sweat stinging her eyes, she had cleared a small section, turning the earth, feeling the gritty promise of it. Silas rode in, dusty and tired. He stopped his horse, watching her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but the next morning, a newer, sharper hoe and a sack of seeds, beans, squash, carrots, lay by the kitchen door. Eliza's heart gave a small, surprised flutter. A trip to Prairie View for supplies was an ordeal. As Eliza walked beside Silas down the main street, a boardwalk that creaked under every footfall, she felt the stares. Women paused in their conversations, their eyes lingering on her plain dress, her work-roughened hands. Mrs. Pendleton, the storekeeper's wife, a woman whose corsetry seemed to armor her against any form of compassion, appraised Eliza with a look that could curdle milk. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice sharp, "and your new help." The emphasis on help was a subtle barb. Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My wife, Mrs. Pendleton, Mrs. Blackwood." The air crackled. Mrs. Pendleton's smile was thin, brittle. "Well, now, isn't that practical?" Eliza felt a flush creep up her neck, but she met the woman's gaze steadily. "Good day, Mrs. Pendleton." Her voice was quiet, but held no apology. Back in the buckboard, Silas was silent, his profile rigid as he stared ahead. Eliza thought he was angry, perhaps regretting his declaration. But as they neared the ranch, he said, his voice gruff, "Pay her no mind. Some folks got nothing better to do than stir dust." It wasn't an apology, not quite, but it was something. A shield, perhaps. Grimes, the oldest of Silas's ranch hands, was a gnarled root of a man, his cynicism as deeply ingrained as the dirt under his fingernails. He'd watch Eliza from under the brim of his hat, a knowing smirk on his lips. One morning, as she wrestled with a heavy sack of flour, he drawled, loud enough for her to hear, "Reckon some brides bring a dowry, others just bring an appetite." The words stung, raw and unfair. She bit her lip, hauled the sack onto the counter, and turned to face him, her eyes clear. "And some men, Mr. Grimes, mistake a woman's need for a lack of worth. I earn my keep." Grimes looked surprised, then grunted and shuffled away. Later that day, Silas assigned Grimes the unenviable task of mucking out the most neglected of the stables, a job usually rotated among the younger hands. Silas said nothing to Eliza about it. Summer settled, hot and relentless. The sun beat down, baking the land until the grass turned brittle and brown. Eliza's small garden, however, thrived under her diligent care. She carried water endlessly, shielded tender shoots from the worst of the heat. The vibrant green was a splash of defiance against the dun landscape. She found a wild raspberry patch by the creek and painstakingly gathered the fruit, making a few precious jars of jam. She left one on the table for Silas. He ate it with his morning biscuits, a small, almost imperceptible nod his only comment. but he finished the jar. One sweltering afternoon, a cry went up from the corrals. A young calf, spooked by a snake, had gotten itself tangled in a coil of loose barbed wire. The hands were struggling, the mother cow bellowing in distress. Silas was there, his face grim, trying to cut the wire without further injuring the panicked animal. Eliza, seeing the blood and the fear, didn't hesitate. She grabbed a clean rag and a bucket of water from the kitchen. "Hold his head steady," she told a surprised young hand, her voice calm but firm. She knelt, speaking softly to the terrified calf, her touch gentle as she cleaned the wounds, assessing the damage. "The wire's deep here, Mr. Blackwood. If you cut, pull it away from the leg, not towards it." He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, then nodded. Together, with her guiding the panicked limbs and soothing the animal, and Silas's strong hands on the cutters, they freed the calf. It was shaken, bleeding, but alive. As Silas examined the calf's injuries, his touch surprisingly gentle, he said, not looking at Eliza, "Where'd you learn about doctoring stock?" "My father kept a few animals. You learn what you have to when there's no one else to do it." Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity. He just nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual. That evening, the silence at dinner felt different. Less a void, more a shared space, filled with the unspoken events of the day. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the chill in the house began to recede. Eliza found a few of Silas's late mother's linens, carefully stored away. She aired them, mended them, and the table, set with a clean, darned cloth and a small jar of wildflowers from the prairie, looked less forbidding. She started humming as she worked, quiet tunes from a life she was trying to stitch together with this new one. Silas began to speak more. Not much, but a comment on the weather, an observation about the cattle. He asked her once, abruptly, "Where you from, originally?" "Ohio, a small farm." She didn't elaborate on the sickness that took her parents, the debts that swallowed the farm whole. He just nodded. But he started leaving the Prairie View Chronicle on the kitchen table after he'd read it, a silent offering. One evening, a fierce thunderstorm rolled in, the sky splitting with lightning, the rain lashing down in sheets. A crack of thunder, louder than the rest, shook the house. Eliza, mending by the fading light, jumped. Silas, who'd been staring into the fire, looked over. "Spooks you?" "A bit," she admitted. "We had a barn strike once, lost everything in it." He was silent for a time, then said, "This house has stood for 50 years. It'll stand through this." There was a quiet reassurance in his tone that warmed her more than the fire. The turning point came with the first chill of autumn. Silas, out checking fence lines in a remote part of the ranch, was caught in an early, unexpected downpour that quickly turned to sleet. He returned late, soaked to the bone, shivering, his face pale. By morning, he was consumed by fever. Grimes and the other hands were capable with cattle, with the land, but a sickroom was foreign territory. They looked to Eliza, their usual gruffness replaced with a worried uncertainty. Eliza felt a surge of fear, but pushed it down. She'd nursed her mother through her final illness. She knew the grim tenacity it required. "Keep the ranch running, Mr. Grimes," she said, her voice steady. "I'll see to Mr. Blackwood." For days, she was a constant presence in his sick room. She bathed his fevered brow, forced broth and water between his cracked lips, changed sweat-soaked linens. The house was quiet, save for Silas's ragged breathing and her own soft movements. She rarely slept, dozing in a chair by his bedside. The vastness of the prairie, the isolation of the ranch, which had once seemed so oppressive, now felt like a cocoon, holding them in its fragile care. There was no one else, Only her. Mrs. Pendleton arrived one afternoon, unannounced, ostensibly to offer neighborly assistance, her eyes sharp and judgmental. "He looks dreadful," she pronounced, peering at Silas. "Are you quite sure you know what you're doing, child? A man in his condition needs proper care." The implication was clear. Eliza was incapable, perhaps even neglectful. Eliza straightened, her weariness a heavy cloak, but her gaze was firm. "He is getting proper care, Mrs. Pendleton. What he needs most now is rest and quiet." She stood between the woman and Silas's bed, a small, determined guardian. Mrs. Pendleton sniffed. "Well, I hope for his sake you're right. It would be a tragedy if—" She left the sentence hanging, a poisonous dart. Just then, Silas stirred, his eyes, clouded with fever, focusing on Eliza. He lifted a weak hand, fumbling for hers. "Eliza?" His voice was a hoarse whisper. She took his hand, her touch gentle. "I'm here, Silas." It was the first time she'd used his given name. It felt natural, right. He looked past her, his gaze settling on Mrs. Pendleton. A flicker of his old strength returned. "She stays. Good woman." His eyes closed again, but his hand tightened on Eliza's. Mrs. Pendleton, for once, seemed at a loss for words. She mumbled a hasty goodbye and departed, her mission of doubt thwarted. Eliza sank back into the chair, Silas's hand still in hers. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. He'd called her a good woman. He trusted her. Slowly, painstakingly, Silas began to recover. The fever broke, and color returned to his face. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. Eliza continued to care for him, spooning broth, helping him sit up. The silences between them were no longer awkward, but filled with a new, fragile understanding. He watched her as she moved about the room, a quiet intensity in his gaze. One afternoon, as she helped him back to bed after a short, shaky walk around the room, he caught her hand. "Eliza." She met his gaze. "Yes, Silas?" "Thank you." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of all he couldn't, or wouldn't, easily say. You saved my life." "You'd have done the same for me," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true of the man he had been. But it was true of the man he was becoming, the man she was seeing now. He shook his head slightly. "Don't know about that. I'm not good with tending." A shadow of his old gruffness, but softened now, vulnerable. "This ranch, it was just land and work, until you came." Elisa's heart swelled. "It's a good ranch, Silas, a good home." "Vo." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that saw past the plain dress, the tired lines around her eyes, and into the steady, kind heart beneath. "It's a home now," he said, his voice husky, "because you're here." He squeezed her hand. "That preacher, he's due next week. Still inclined?" A slow smile spread across Eliza's face, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. "I am, Silas, very much inclined." The day the preacher came, the sun shone brightly on the Bar M. The house felt different, warmer, filled with the scent of baking bread and the quiet bustle of Eliza's contentment. She wore a new dress, a simple calico she'd sewn herself, its soft blue the color of a spring sky. Silas stood beside her, no longer the remote, assessing rancher, but a man whose eyes held a warmth that mirrored the sun. Grimes and the other hand stood awkwardly in the parlor, hats in hand, their faces scrubbed clean. Even Grimes managed a gruff, "Ma'am," that sounded almost like respect. Mrs. Pendleton was not invited. The vows they spoke were simple, traditional. But for Eliza and Silas, they resonated with a depth of meaning forged in shared hardship, quiet understanding, and a love that had taken root in the unlikeliest of soils. After the preacher left, Silas took Eliza's hand and led her out to the porch. They stood for a moment, looking out over the vast expanse of the Bar M, the land stretching away under a boundless sky. The wind still whispered, but now it sounded less like a lament, more like a promise. "It's a hard life, Eliza," Silas said, his voice quiet. "But it's a good life, Silas," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "With a kind heart beside you." He put his arm around her, holding her close. He had no money to offer her when she arrived, only himself, raw and unyielding as the land. He had thought he was acquiring a housekeeper. He had found a partner, a companion, a woman whose quiet strength and unwavering kindness had brought life not just to his house, but to his heart. The ranch was rich in land and cattle, but Silas Blackwood knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his greatest wealth now stood beside him. And Eliza, who had arrived with nothing but hope, found she had everything that mattered. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. A new beginning, earned and cherished, settled over the Bar M ranch. This story of resilience, connection, and quiet triumph reflects the enduring strength of the human spirit. If Eliza and Silas's journey moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And never forget there's no expiration date on finding where you truly belong.